Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is broadcast number 794. For the past few weeks, I've been going into the narcotics connections of the cocaine cartel in Colombia, the links to the Contras, and to Vice President George Bush. And I promised that I would continue this week with the drug connections to Donald Reagan and Merrill Lynch, and E.F. Hutton's office, and Scott Pierce, the brother-in-law of George Bush, with E.F. Hutton. But there have been some other matters in the news that lead up to that very point of the very dangerous drug connections they have to the Nazis in South America. So I'm going to put it in a sequential order and get to Merrill Lynch and Donald Reagan, George Bush's family, and E.F. Hutton in probably the end of this week or next week, hopefully. NBC News had an item, well, many broadcasts had on Sunday, February 22nd, how Donald Reagan, the chief of staff, won't leave the White House. The Republicans are demanding that he go, and the guess is that he would go any time from this week until the end of the year. Donald Reagan says, I will not go, and the problem is maintaining the Godfather watching over the White House for very, very good reasons on where this Contragate story can lead. He can't step out now, and he can't stay. He's between a rock and a hard place. Jack Anderson had a column today that personifies the problems going on in Washington for a long, long time since the end of World War II, continuing right now today, and Contragate doesn't interfere with those efforts or goals or the roles of people such as Frank Carlucci, the National Security Advisor. What Jack Anderson has in the paper today is that National Security Advisor Frank Carlucci secretly asked Texas billionaire H. Ross Perot, who works with Oliver North and the Contragate team, to drop his investigation of a top Pentagon official with his links to organized crime, with a lot of links to organized crime. He asked that this be stopped. Now, President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan asked Mr. Perot to look into the investigation of Richard Armitage, the Assistant Defense Secretary. They allegedly want to stop the drug connections, and the Secretary of Defense, the role that Mr. Carlucci once had, is filled by somebody who was named on the President's Crime Commission, or the Commission on Organized Crime, of having relationships to somebody involved in narcotics traffic with high-level organized crime figures in Washington, D.C., a gambling operation, and so forth. This is a Vietnamese woman who also probably fronts for a lot of people right on behind her. Ross Perot met with Carlucci, according to Jack Anderson, and he asked Perot to call off the investigation, and that he didn't want him to investigate Armitage. And Armitage is named as one of the few people who knew about the Iran arms deals before it was long disclosed, probably long before, and I'm sure that Israel, Iran, and the United States, I know they are heavily involved in narcotics traffic, and the area through Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan is rich with narcotics. This keeps the armies going. Jack Anderson said Ross Perot began checking into Armitage's connections with Nighet O'Rourke, I may not be pronouncing her name right, after it was revealed by the President's Commission on Organized Crime that they interrogated Armitage for his relationship to O'Rourke, and also because he's involved in the Iran-Contra stories and works with those very people through the Defense Department. At Perot's request, Jack Anderson furnished documents concerning Armitage's relationship with O'Rourke. Ross Perot subsequently told Vice President George Bush and high administration officials that his conduct was inappropriate for someone in a sensitive Defense Department position, and Carlucci said, butt off, and don't investigate Armitage, the Defense Department, and the organized crime figures in Washington, D.C., which, of course, go other places besides just Washington, D.C. Now, I mentioned on World Watchers a few weeks back, January the 9th, 1987, an article by Jonathan Whitney on Frank Carlucci, Eric von Marburg, Thomas Cline's, General Richard Secord, and Edwin Wilson, and the connection of these persons with Frank Carlucci. And now Secord, Cline's are defendants with many other good people with the lawsuit at the Christic Institute. Albert Hakim is also a defendant in that group. And the very people that Frank Carlucci works with in the past and works with today come out of TCI out in California that became Stanford Technology, with close links to Otto von Bolschwing, the Galen operation, and the Odessa, Helene von Damme, General Secord, CIA Thomas Cline, and Mr. Erich von Marburg. Now, when they were being investigated for making millions of dollars at the taxpayers' money, stealing our money by skimming off the top of arms to Egypt, the Justice Department started to investigate that 3 years ago, Secord and von Marburg. And Michael Ledeen was one of the people that interfered with the investigation, who worked with them in Iran and also in the Contra area. And Frank Carlucci of the Defense Department stepped in and said, don't prosecute them. As Deputy Defense Secretary in 1982, he overruled the Pentagon's investigation of Secord and von Marburg. And then when he left the Defense Department, he took von Marburg with him. They had very close ties, and he was Pentagon's chief arms sales official. He resigned and went with Carlucci. When Carlucci left the Defense Department for Sears, Roebuck and Company, their World Trade Organization, and von Marburg started getting $200,000 a year as a consultant, and he's very prosperous now, lives in Belgium, works for the LTV Corporation with, of course, their contracts to the United States. So Carlucci interfered into the skimming off of millions of dollars by persons involved with death squads, organized crime, gun running. They're defendants in a suit for von Marburg isn't in the Christic Institute suit, but the others are Mr. Thomas Cline and General Secord, and they are charged with gun running, assassinations, and narcotics traffic. So Carlucci in 1987, as the National Security Advisor, is doing what he was doing way back when, in 1982, interfering with the prosecution of these people. Now, there was a very important newscast simultaneously with a printed article in the San Jose Mercury. The newscast came over CNN February the 20th, 1987. It came out of Mendoza, Argentina. I called Atlanta, Georgia, and checked with CNN, and after reaching the editor's desk, the boardroom, the foreign desk, the newsroom desk, and the assignment desk, I got the producer, and he read me the news story as it was on the air on CNN, early morning hours, February the 20th. It came out of Mendoza, Argentina. It said a businessman said that Adolf Hitler died 1 month ago in January 1987. He didn't die in the Berlin bunker at the end of World War II. Max Gregorczyk said that Eva Braun, Hitler's mistress until the night they left the bunker, and they were married then, is still alive. He can produce proof. He wants a healthy fee, but that's probably to change his identity and get out of Argentina. Gregorczyk said that a friend of his, Juan Aguilera, could back up the proof. They have evidence of paintings that Hitler did recently, and while he lived in Argentina. The burial of Adolf Hitler is in a cemetery in Palmiro, 30 miles east of Mendoza in Argentina. Now, the very same day that this came over the air, early morning, CNN, the San Jose Mercury had a front page picture, a little picture of Adolf Hitler, titled, "Was the Body Hitler's?" A Canadian dental expert says there is new evidence that the body that was found in 1945 was not the Nazi Führer's. And inside there's a long article, "Was the Body Hitler's?" Well, San Jose Mercury had a picture of Hitler in this same kind of a article, not all about Hitler, but about other matters, in the magazine section when I was interviewed, and said Adolf Hitler is still alive, and that was 3 years ago. The story this time comes from the San Jose Mercury and Byline San Diego by Glenna Chu. A Canadian dental expert was speaking to a group of Americans, a scientific group that were meeting in Canada. It was a presentation just last week. The doctor is Dr. Robert Dorian of Montreal, and he concluded that the body found in the Berlin bunker was not Adolf Hitler's, that the teeth don't match the teeth in the corpse that were identified, that he's been studying this for 2 years. Dorian, Director of Forensic Dentistry for the Minister of Solicitor General of Quebec, presented his findings at a conference of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. It's interesting that the Americans were up there hearing about the life of Adolf Hitler when Reinhard Gehlen and the group from the Defense Department have known this all along. I'm sure that they have known this for many reasons. I believe they've known this, but now they're being told this story up in Canada, not in the United States. Dr. Dorian's research was conducted over 2 years to throw a new light on the enduring mystery of the last days of the Reich. This author refers to the enduring mystery. When I say it's a mystery, most people say you're out of your mind, Hitler is dead, and they don't even entertain the fact that it is a mystery. According to some accounts, Hitler and his mistress commit suicide in the bunker. However, the Soviet military officials who were the first to arrive at the bunker said that Hitler may have escaped. There was an escape route, a secret tunnel that led from the personal room to an underground trolley line. The mystery grew in 1968 when a Soviet journalist published a book saying that the Soviets examined the body of Hitler, claimed it was Hitler based on conclusions and interviews with Hitler's dentist, who described the work done in Hitler's mouth. After the autopsy, the remains were incinerated and scattered. The book has photographs of the corpse's teeth and bridge work, and also details from the dentist about Hitler's teeth, but these were the inconsistencies that Dr. Dorian has studied. 1, 2 lower bridges found in the corpse that are not visible in photographs taken of Hitler. The Hitler's dentist said, and when questioned by the American officials, never did mention installing any bridges at all, and 2 bridges were found with the corpse, and not seen in pictures, but they were found with the corpse, and the dentist said he never put in bridges. He remembered every single detail of the upper mouth and bridge, not a single thing about the lowers. 2, the dentist said he had performed a root canal in a certain tooth. In the corpse, it was a natural, untouched tooth. There was no evidence of a root canal. 3, the dental assistant said one of Hitler's lower right teeth was porcelain. In the corpse, it showed that this tooth, whoever it was a natural tooth. And finally, the pattern of gaps between Hitler's teeth does not match the corpse's teeth, according to the way they were drawn out by the dentist and what was seen on the body, and then with the pictures of Hitler later. Lester Luntz, a Connecticut dentist who's been investigating Hitler's purported death, now there's a question about it and a mystery, for nearly 20 years said he's convinced that the body in the bunker was not that of the Fuhrer. And this is the latest, February the 20th, 1987. Now, on World Watcher's program in 1981, I discussed interviews and research done to show that Hitler's mistress may have escaped the Berlin bunker. That was admitted first, and these gentlemen in Argentina say that she is still alive. From London, new dental evidence uncovered by a California research team strongly suggests that the woman found next to Adolf Hitler was not his mistress, Eva Braun. This was reported in the British Medical Journal. The findings indicate Ms. Braun was buried elsewhere, may even have escaped alive. Imagine that, the British Medical Association News Review said. Soviet soldiers who captured the German capital in the spring came upon 13 bodies near the bunker, and they cited autopsy reports to prove the body of Hitler and Miss Braun were among them. But the British Medical Journal said after a 10-year study of World War II, the records revealed that the Soviet evidence on Hitler matches the Nazi leader's known dental records. This is on Adolf Hitler, and there were 28 or 26 separate points, including a unique window crown on one tooth and bridgework in Hitler's lower right jaw. And now it turns out that what they identified as Hitler's wasn't true at all. He didn't have this bridgework in his lower jaw, and in the interrogation of the dentist that's now been made available, there was no such thing on the jaw, and this was in the autopsy report. The odontological data virtually eliminates the previous assumption that Eva Braun was buried. They assumed she was. There was evidence that a dental bridge for Miss Braun, used to link her corpse with Hitler's, had in reality never been installed in her mouth. Several teeth found with the body showed extensive cavities. Miss Braun's dental record showed the same teeth cavity-free. It claimed that there were 2 cosmetic Hollywood crowns made of fireproof porcelain that should have been found on the body but weren't. The medical journal said the woman whose remains were found in the Soviets had suffered extensive shrapnel wounds and hemorrhaging. Miss Braun was told, or we believed, by many to have committed suicide by taking poison. Ryder Sognaes, Sognaes, who moved to UCLA, a professor of oral biology and anatomy at the University of California at Los Angeles, said the Russian identification of Miss Braun would never stand up in court. Is it possible that Eva Braun escaped? After all, there were a number of men in the bunker unaccounted for who could have helped her. Nobody actually witnessed her death. There are inconsistencies in the account of those who took Eva's body out of the bunker. Hitler's final hours were documented by aides who were with him, including Martin Bormann, on April the 30th, 1945. Now, Martin Bormann escaped and spent 2 years taking all of Hitler's papers and records out of the country. There's every reason to believe, of course, that he did escape with Hans Ulrich Rudel, his top pilot, who was flying all of their papers down to Argentina for 2 years before the war was over. The article from London says an autopsy was conducted May 18th, 1945, at a military hospital in a Berlin suburb. On the basis of that autopsy, they said Hitler and Miss Braun had died. But being done in a Berlin suburb, the Fuhrer could easily escape, and those people would be anxious to say that they died. The British Medical Association reviewed the information, obtained handwritten report of the dental technician, Fritz Eichmann, testifying that the gold bridge with 4 teeth he made for Miss Braun never was installed. There was no time, and this led to researchers to the dental assistant, Kathy Kuserman, who is now in her 50s, living quietly in West Germany, who confirmed and filled in details of Miss Braun's dental history. So just this week, Adolf Hitler is presented through dental records as having lived, and at the same time, this week, the evidence comes out. Hitler died conveniently a month ago at the age of 98, and if you think it's impossible to live till 98, turn on Today's Show, NBC, every day from 7 to 9 a.m. on the West Coast, and see Willard Scott showing pictures and happy birthday to people 100 years and older. Evidently, Adolf didn't make it. Now, I also had on the air a few years ago connections to the Nazi network that these people carefully set up, and a lot of the information I had regarded Errol Flynn because of his work with Ronald Reagan at a very crucial period, and I took it from Charles Hyam's book, Errol Flynn, The Untold Story. And for new listeners, I just want to review this because of the importance of Ronald Reagan's going to Bitburg, of his hiring a member of the Hitler Youth to replace Mr. Buchanan to write his speeches, and now the push for Adolf Hitler's agent, Rudolf Hess, to be released from Spandau prison by Ronald Reagan in the spring of this year. Reagan's links to these Nazis is not coincidental. His secretary for 8 years in California, Helene von Damm, worked for Otto von Bolschwing out of the Reinhard Gehlen network, a top agent of the Waffen-SS, and then she went on to make appointments for Reagan for his 2 periods as president, and after the second election, making appointments, she then went to Vienna and married, as the ambassador of Vienna, married a wealthy man in Vienna, and is back at home in the city where all of this began in the first place. In The Untold Story by Charles Hyam, he tells about the movie Santa Fe Trail Ronald Reagan made with Errol Flynn, and then in 1942, Desperate Journey Ronald Reagan made with Errol Flynn. Now, can you be tainted by co-starring in 2 movies while Errol Flynn is going on and doing his dirty work? That alone doesn't taint you, but everything Ronald Reagan did for the House hearings on the actors, the equivalent of Senator Joe McCarthy hearings, blacklisting, having people blacklisted and deprived of jobs in Hollywood, and his work working from General Electric up to hiring Helene von Damm and working with top Nazis in California and then in Washington. His career has been simpatico and along the lines that Errol Flynn would have continued if he were alive, but they had these very crucial years together. In between these 2 pictures, Errol Flynn was going to Mexico frequently. The FBI was trailing him. They had a list of people he met with, the heads of the Nazi Gestapo and the Abwehr, the German intelligence. There were 700 Nazi agents in Mexico City when Flynn was down there, and it was a headquarters from Nazis from the U.S., Japan, Central America, and Spain, waiting for the Axis to make a conquest of Mexico. Errol Flynn visited George Nicholas, the Nazi Party chief, and Hans Hellermann, the Gestapo contacts of Dr. Urban, and in the Bahamas he was meeting with Axel Wenner Grant. Grant is the head of the Electrolux firm. Grant set up the networks in South America with Rudolf Hess to take all of South America and turn it Nazi, then move to Central America and take America in that route. That was the way they were to go. Hess laying out the framework for years, since the 30s, to make all of South America Nazi, Central America, and then America, simultaneously working with the Grand Mufti in Jerusalem, making all the Middle East and Africa, the northern part of Africa, and the Arab countries Nazi, to take the Mediterranean and push it from that end, these people working together. Errol Flynn was down in the Bahamas with Axel Wenner-Gren, at that time referred to as the richest man in the world, who was the munition maker for Adolf Hitler, supplying Hitler, making weapons through his good friend Hermann Goering, and arms were shipped continuously to Norway from Axel Wenner-Gren's headquarters. He was above international law, and in Charles Hyam's book, Errol Flynn, The Untold Story, he tells about Axel Wenner-Gren, the Nazi munitions maker who introduced Errol Flynn to the Canadian Sir Harry Oakes and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. And, of course, the Harry Oakes story is very, very important to this. Now, the link of these persons goes on continuously right to Francois Junod. I won't have time to do a lot of them on him this weekend, but he's the top Nazi in Switzerland who funds the accounts of Adolf Hitler, or Hitler until last month, and the Goering family, and Martin Bormann. He's the banker that lives in Switzerland. He attended the meetings when the Nazis went underground with Martin Bormann there, and Bormann was one of the last people in the bunker when Hitler allegedly left, and they planned their removal very, very carefully, years ahead, 2 years ahead. And so the links of Junod in Switzerland now, he's funding Jacques Verge, the attorney for Klaus Barbie, for his trial. Well, this is the 4th year now that he's sitting in prison. And he's also funding the trial for the terrorist of direct action, Mr. Abdallah, who is being tried starting this week. Junod, the Nazi, funds the left Arab connections, the Grand Mufti connections, and the terrorist organizations, as well as the far right. The left-right merge, and I want to do more on the left-right continuously. I've done some before, and it's very important. But Francois Junod, the money man for the trial of the terrorists in Paris right now, the money man for paying Jacques Verge to represent both Klaus Barbie and Mr. Abdallah in Paris, comes from Junod, who worked and works with Martin Bormann and Joseph Mengele, and has had the rights to all of Adolf Hitler's material up to and through whatever time it takes, I guess, for the rest of Hitler's memory, any books that come out that were left from Hitler after the war. There's an article, quite a few articles on the jewelry of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, part of this team with Axel Wenner-Gren and Errol Flynn, and the Gestapo and Rudolf Hess, and they left all of their jewelry to the charity, the Pasteur Clinic, that Pasteur Institute, a French biological research organization, and their scientists are the ones that have been working for the disease, or supposedly to find a vaccine to defeat AIDS. Now, the vaccine they want is to protect those people that are meant to live and give them immunization, and the others won't have access to it, just as the Fort Detrick's Maryland scientists and the Pasteur Clinic work on creating a cure for certain diseases before they spread it among the masses, so that in case it escapes, they themselves have the cure. The Pasteur Clinic in the United States are active in Zaire, which has a large amount of AIDS, and in Africa, and the money from the jewelry from the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, after leaving the scene of the Gestapo and Rudolf Hess and Goering and Axel Wenner-Gren, is to leave approximately $7 million in jewelry that will go to AIDS, that will be in the hands of persons at the Pasteur Clinic with a track record that is really fearful. Now, there have been articles that emerge from time to time, and now they're heating up now, that Ronald Reagan is urged to escort Hess out of prison. A friend sent me this from the Oregonian, January the 31st, 1987. Leaders of a group of German Americans urged President Reagan on Thursday to go to West Berlin and personally escort Rudolf Hess, the last surviving major war criminal, out of Spandau prison. First of all, Joseph Mengele is alive. Second, Martin Bormann is alive. He's not the last surviving, but Rudolf Hess, and I don't believe it for a minute, this is the Rudolf Hess that is there, the genius between South America, Central America, and Nazism and corporate combinations in this country. I don't believe that's him, but it would be symbolic for Hess living in South America or Switzerland to see somebody escort that poor dog out of the prison, meaning we give approval to you now and we're not looking at you as a war criminal anymore. This request for Reagan goes to a visit coming up in West Berlin in June of this year, and Hess is held by the United States, the French, the British, and the Soviets. And Stan Rittenhouse, president of the German-American Information and Education Association, said, all Mr. Reagan needs to do is visit Mr. Hess when it is America's turn to guard him and tell this harmless old man of 92, I'm going to make you a free man. Now, it is the symbolism of Ronald Reagan going there that is important for the world to see, just as is putting a wreath on the graves of the Waffen-SS. It is the symbolism that Reagan works with, telling them it's okay and kosher now. Come on, Mr. Hess. And the man isn't going to say anything that anyone will recognize because it hasn't been Hess for a long, long time. Now, Phyllis Schlafly, the woman behind Ronald Reagan's entire career, with Patrick Frawley of the John Birch Society, has written an article January 29th. It was in the Washington Times. Memoirs going up in smoke. It isn't clear which of the three superpowers continues to impose on Rudolf Hess's history's most famous protracted case of solitary confinement and isolation. We urge Ronald Reagan to release Hess, release him. He took an airplane, and this is important, May the 10th, 1941, and he landed in the backyard of the Duke of Hamilton. He landed in the darkness on the property of the Duke of Hamilton. And the pilot was Rudolf Hess, and he came asking Great Britain to assist Germany to fight Russia at that time. We hadn't even declared war against Germany when Rudolf Hess flew over to England, so it's interesting that he's been locked up all this time. Now, what Phyllis Schlafly is saying, we don't want the memoirs to go up in the smoke, but on the other hand, she admits that Hess writes his memoirs. He writes them every day. He completes a section every month. It's taken from the guards, and it's burned without his knowledge, but the whole world knows it. So you don't know what he wrote, and you may just be writing on how to grow nasturtiums and not anything about Rudolf Hess's experiences, and that's why it has to be burned. She says, save this history, but the history has been burned for over 40 years. She does admit that his court-appointed lawyer has never been allowed to speak to him of his trial or sentence. This is exactly the way Vance Cooper was treated when he was put in place of Howard Hughes and carried around various countries, and it wasn't Howard Hughes at all. This man was drugged and kept in a stupor and compared to a victim of a Nazi concentration camp. Robert Mayu never saw Howard Hughes. Chester Davis never saw Howard Hughes. The top persons of the Summa Corporation never saw Howard Hughes. Paul Laxalt in Vegas as governor never saw Howard Hughes, and the court-appointed lawyer for Hess never saw Hess. Amnesty International, the Red Cross, are not permitted to visit him. When he dies, he will be cremated immediately, and a doctor who saw him said the rib cages were entirely different than the ribs wounds of Rudolf Hess from World War I. His ashes will be scattered. They can't be given to the family, and what Phyllis Schlafly doesn't say is that Spandau prison is all set to be detonated. They're going to destroy and bomb the entire place where he is. She claims that, wouldn't you think now that we would let him out? But what Phyllis Schlafly is saying, and she's worked with these Nazis, neo-Nazis, old Nazis, tired Nazis, young Nazis, and the Knights of Malta, what she's saying is, let the symbolism, let the President of the United States go get Hess out, and it's like saying at Bitburg, we approve of you, Mr. Hess, you were right, the Russians are bad, come with us. In all these years, 40 years, first 10 years he couldn't see his family. I mentioned this before in broadcast. Then no member of the family can touch him. No member of the family can record anything he says. And he walks around with a guard there all the time, lights on all the time, and they can't even feel his hands to know whether he has the same touch as the father, as the husband, and so forth. Family are living. And for 10 years, they didn't see him at all. So while they caged in this symbol, the network was set up for the Odessa to take the United States, to take over the world, these various countries, and with the exception of about 5 or 10, they have it all now. And now they want all the dressings, the wrappings, and this is why it's important to take heed. The CNN broadcast was on the 20th. This is the 24th. There isn't a thing so far in the news other than the San Jose Mercury story, or the 23rd rather, about the story of Hitler in Argentina, even though many, many people know throughout the world that Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun did not die in the bunker, and the effect of what they did is what we're feeling. The flight capital out of this country, the farms closing, the pollution. The network is perfect. It worked. And he's 98. He could die, and he could rest in peace because everything he wanted is just about here. We'll take a 1-minute break and continue on the story of Hess, Henry Kissinger, Fritz Kramer, and the importance of this story that Hitler only died 1 month ago. This is Mae Brussell. It's the second half of World Watchers, program number 793. In case you missed the first half hour, I was talking about the CNN report that Adolf Hitler was buried in Argentina last month, and also the San Jose Mercury report of a medical convention in Canada just last week, and the presentation of information of a dentist from Quebec, a researcher from Quebec, on the fact that Adolf Hitler did not die in the bunker. Now, what is the transition between that and Ronald Reagan's work with Errol Flynn in the early years when Flynn was with Rudolf Hess, Hess with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and the Gestapo network, between Britain, Germany, Hermann Goering, the Bahamas, Mexico, and Hollywood? There's a common denominator that runs through all of this. One is Alexander Haig, the other is Henry Kissinger, and above them, of course, the notorious Fritz Kramer. Now, I want to read parts of an article I've had for many years, and some I've had on the air before, from Executive Intelligence Review, written by Scott Thompson in September of 1982. This was written 4 years ago, so you can compare the news of 1986 to what was written 4 years ago as a background for today's headlines. The article is about Henry Kissinger's connections to the British institutions. He went from Germany to Britain before he came to the United States, as did Fritz Kramer and Alexander Haig. Of course, they're very close to the British powers that be and institutions. Henry was a regular visitor in Great Britain to the Institute for Strategic Studies and Chatham House, and it's called the Royal Institute for International Affairs. But in the United States, the Study for Strategic and International Studies, the Georgetown Center, is very closely linked to the British counterpart, as are the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Society, and the Royal Institute for International Affairs. They're all part of what Cecil Rhodes set up in Britain a long time ago called the Round Table Group. And if you're not familiar with it, there's some very good books on Cecil Rhodes, his racist feelings, and his attitudes towards minorities. He came out of South Africa, famous for the diamond mines, and lived and put his money in Britain in these very far right-wing organizations, and set up what was called the Cliveden set in Great Britain. That was Lord and Lady Astor, and they were very close to Germans and Nazis, and that group is still very active. The Cliveden set have many, many members. This article tells about Henry Kissinger's British controllers, who are second and third generation of the early Cecil Rhodes Round Table Group. They include Lord Peter Carrington. Now, Peter Carrington, that they're describing in 1982, was instrumental with Henry Kissinger, and Oliver North in helping overthrow Grenada in 1983. And then Lord Carrington went on to become head of NATO, and he's the head of NATO at the current time. This was written 4 years ago. Lord Peter Carrington, who has joined Henry's new consulting firm, that's Kissinger Associates, the one that Congressman Henry Gonzalez calls the hired gun, or the agency our State Department is leased to. Kissinger Associates. Carrington has been in secret collaboration with Henry Kissinger since 1968, when they joined a reorganized P2 Freemasonic Lodge, making it a coordinating center of both the red and black terrorism for the strategy of tension. That goes into the Bologna bombing and Otto Skorzeny and Stefano Della Calle, creating the tension and bombings to make the right do the work and make it look like the left did it. Carrington was part of a NATO-run destabilization of Italy. Carrington's family is of Scottish bankers. They were ennobled for acting as financiers of William Pitt the Younger, who launched the 18th and 19th century Propaganda One Lodge with the French Duke d'Orléans as part of the Jacobin destruction of the French Republic through the Reign of Terror. That was P1. In 1967, Lord Carrington joined the board of Hambros Bank, which is then Michele Sindona's main partner in Banca Privativa Financiera, that used to launder NATO funds to P2 members through a wave of coup attempts, bombings, and assassinations in Italy. And, of course, Michael Sindona came to this country and emptied out the Franklin Bank of $45 million and worked closely with our Secretary of the Treasury, David Kennedy, with the Continental Bank in Illinois. This article says, in 1969, Henry Kissinger, then National Security Advisor, the job Mr. Frank Carlucci has now, sent his assistant Alexander Haig to oversee the project in the field. 1 year later, British Prime Minister Ted Heath named Lord Carrington Minister of Defense and top troubleshooter. From that position, Carrington remained in charge of destabilizing Italy. And I want to interject because it's 4 years later. This is where Michael Ledeen comes in from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Claire Sterling and Paul Hensa, and Mr. Abshir of the Center, who now is cleaning out the information that is going to the President of the United States, trying to cleanse, sanitize the Contragate for the powers that be. Going back to the article, despite his resignation as British Foreign Minister over the Malvinas crisis, Lord Carrington remains the principal architect of the strategy to negotiate a global arrangement with the Soviets, temporarily at least, which involves destroying the U.S. prestige and influence in favor of British or British-French superpower in the West. And also, I might say, when Carrington was in trouble because he was favoring the Argentine junta, Alexander Haig was forced to resign at the same time because he was sympathetic to the fascist Nazi junta, the P2 members, and Licio Gelli, living in Argentina as against the British interests. The article continues, Carrington, Kissinger, and Haig and others triggered the Malvinas crisis, also the war in Lebanon, undermining the United States' influence in South America and the Middle East. Eastern Europe and the Balkans and other areas are becoming destabilized, while they encourage a opening with the People's Republic of China to arm them to fight, of course, the Soviet Union. Now we get to Rudolf Hess, the gentleman that the late Larry MacDonald wanted out, that the German organizations want out, that Phyllis Schlafly wants out. Lord Alec Douglas Home of Herschel, Hirsel, the former British Prime Minister, 1963 to 1964, the time period when Kennedy was murdered, and Foreign Secretary 1970 to 74, that was the Watergate period, when Kissinger and Haig were running the White House. He has been revered by Kissinger as, in quotes, that rarest of statesmen, one of the wisest men I've ever known. This is Lord Alec Douglas Home. Kissinger admitted in May 10, 1982, at a Chatham House confession that he kept Lord Home better informed and more closely engaged than appropriate agencies of the United States government. Of Kissinger, Lord Home said, I worked with him for many years in my office capacity. Our London purposes have been the same as his. The mutual phrase is ironic. Lord Home is a survivor of Munich, 1938. In 1938, the same year that the Kissinger family left the Nazis and moved to England, Lord Home, then named Lord Douglas, traveled to Munich as British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's private secretary. There he met Il Duce Benito Mussolini, Field Marshal Hermann Goering, while Chamberlain hammered out a pact with Hitler that would allow the removal by partition or blitzkrieg strikes of the buffer states that separated Nazi Germany from the drive east into the Soviet heartland that the Round Table Group had planned for a long time. The Prime Minister's relative, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, is a member of a special order, the Isis Uranian Order, part of Cecil Rhodes' group that set up psychical research, that worked with the Bavarian Thule Society that indoctrinated Hitler, that made the core of the Alamein SS, the blood and soil version of this plan that appears in Mein Kampf. After rearming of the Rhineland, Lord Home his newly appointed Neville Chamberlain's private secretary toured Germany to inspect progress of the Hitler project. Lord Home was born in the center of the British royal family. He was shaped by the same influences that would later shape Henry Kissinger. His father, the 13th Earl of Home, was suspected at one time of communist leanings, but of course that was just a suspect. He was hardly anything but a communist. Lord Alec Douglas Home was descended from the Black Douglas, a Scottish marcher lord in the ranks of King Robert Bruce, and was the closest relative of the 14th Duke of Hamilton, the premier peer of Scotland, upon whose nearby estate Deputy Reichsfuhrer Rudolf Hess landed one night in the end of 1939 to 1940. He attempted to mobilize the British to support the drive east against Russia. He was instructed as a youth by Sir Douglas Haig. This is Lord Home, Kissinger's friend, who is the closest relative to the 14th Duke of Hamilton, where Rudolf Hess landed. Let me repeat again. Lord Home was instructed as a youth by Sir Douglas Haig, the World War I Field Marshal, who was a cousin of the former Secretary of State Alexander Haig, and by Lord Robert Cecil, the son of Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister, who patronized the Milner Rhodes Group. Lord Cecil, the Viscount of Chelwood, founded the Royal Institute of International Affairs in 1919. At the end of World War I, when Germany was rearming, they met with Lionel Curtis, a member of the Round Table. He also founded the League of Nations to manipulate world affairs towards the direction of World War II, and the Moral Rearmament Movement, of which Ronald Reagan was a member in his early career in California, and continued, I'm sure. That was the Royal Rearmament Movement, called the Oxford Movement, recruited SS Chief Heinrich Himmler and Field Marshal Goering in an attempt to form an English-American-German-Japanese axis in the early 30s. Kissinger joined the Moral Rearmament Group after World War II, and several years ago I had Ronald Reagan's membership of the Moral Rearmament Group. Lord Home was polished as the aristocrat's Christ Church College, Oxford, by Arnold Toynbee, and he was briefed with intelligence and worked with the Foreign Research and Press Service based in British intelligence. With Henry Kissinger as his junior partner in the late 1960s, of course, this is after John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were killed and Kissinger took over the National Security Council. Groomed as his junior partner in the 60s and early 70s, Lord Home pursued the same political thrust he had in the 30s. He initiated the policy to open the door to China, a long-standing personal tie that he wanted, using Henry Kissinger and President Nixon as bait. They set out to recruit the People's Republic of China to the same marcher-lord role against the Soviets that was filled earlier by Nazi Germany. And of course, George Bush was our ambassador to China, and Henry Kissinger is lauded as opening door to China, but for a particular reason. Lord Home was kept directly appraised by Henry Kissinger of his actions as NSC advisor, later as Secretary of State. He called for Nixon's Watergating, the removing of Nixon, and he had been earlier a party, as head British Prime Minister, to the decision of those persons responsible for the murder of John Kennedy, executing the British, this is William Stevenson of OSS, British Intelligence, and CIA, making up the organization Permindex and Murder Incorporated, that Jim Garrison, the District Attorney of New Orleans, called attention to. Kennedy had just fired Kissinger from the National Security Council and had negotiated a test ban treaty with Moscow. And so Henry Kissinger's links go back to Lord Hamilton and to the British persons who were very much a part of his career for many, many years. Now, this article on Henry Kissinger's background and the links to Hess and Lord Hume continue. What is known is that in 1944, Henry Kissinger, who was a private first class in the U.S. Army, was picked up by his first and most important patron, Fritz Kramer, who was, like Kissinger, a refugee from Germany at the time of their meeting. He was a member of U.S. Army intelligence. Trained in the London School of Economics, Kramer became an eminence gris at the Pentagon and an international leader of the relationships that I've described above. His closest friend was J. Lovestone, once the Secretary General of the Communist Party, and Lovestone turned the AFL CIO into the group that became the murder squads that released the organized crime syndicates. And this is where the narcotics connections come in that I'm talking about. The White House the Defense Department, the National Security Council, the CIA. The narcotics traffics began in Marseille and in Sicily, and it began after the war with Lucky Luciano. And the relationship started with Fritz Kramer and Jay Lovestone, who brought in the thugs and released Lucky Luciano from New York to go to Italy to set up the drug traffic that they profited by, along with Meyer Lansky, in return for stopping all the leftists and breaking up labor unions and the resistance to Nazism during the war. Lovestone became an agent of the OSS and was discovered by Fritz Kramer and the CIA, and later Kramer led a right-wing split in the National Socialist International with Lee Kuan Yew, Y-E-W, a British intelligence officer who became the Prime Minister of Singapore and was present at meetings between Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, and Schmidt at the Bohemian Grove. This was in August of 1982. Now, at the Bohemian Grove, when Henry Kissinger comes, they play Hail to the Chief, as if he is not only the President of the United States, but he is the chief of this whole network, and that's why Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer are so important. They were meeting in 1982 and every year since and before, I suppose, attending the meetings of the Bohemian Grove. Kramer is also one of the more influential figures within the West German Lutheran Church, and Reinhard Gehlen resigned the CIA and the BND to go into church activities. He has been a longtime friend and advisor to Oscar and Karl Wilhelm von Prusing, the heads of the House of Hohenzollern, once emperors of Germany. If you wonder about their credentials, read Charles Heim's book, the one that followed the Errol Flynn one on trading with the enemy and the American swastika, and get the background of the Hohenzollerns. And it describes Fritz Kramer's close arrangement, and that involves the Nazi banks and the plans, again, for the Fourth Reich. They were once emperors of Germany and would like to return. Through the Protestant Church, Kramer maintains close ties with the monarchy and the powers that be in Switzerland, where he keeps a chalet for annual vacations. Fritz Kramer has many protégés, among whom is Alexander Haig, who Kramer found when he was still a paperclip colonel at the Pentagon. Paperclip may be linked to the Project Paperclip, Star Wars, and the Nazi scientists that came here, they refer to him as a paperclip colonel. It may be a figure of speech, but he does have those connections. Kramer remained in the Emergency Planning Division of the Pentagon as a geopolitician in the Halford Mackinder School until Haig's removal from Secretary of State's office. Now, as I cited just a month ago, the current Fritz Kramer, the same one we're talking about, is in the National Security with Frank Carlucci. He's been there 6 years. He's been there ever since Kennedy was killed, I suppose, simultaneously while having other jobs. Kramer obtained for Kissinger a series of posts with U.S. Army intelligence and counterintelligence, calling him affectionately "my little Jew." Another protege of Fritz Kramer was Helmut Sonnenfeld, who would later be Kissinger's counselor at the State Department. Sonnenfeld got this job that didn't require Senate confirmation because his 1970 nomination as Undersecretary of the Treasury under George Shultz was withdrawn when it was revealed in hearings that Sonnenfeld was investigated by the CIA, State Department Security, and Justice Department in the 1960s for espionage on behalf of Israel. He escaped the trial only because the material he passed to the Israelis was too sensitive to be exposed in court proceedings. Ironically, one of the tasks Henry Kissinger, Kramer, and Sonnenfeld and associates were involved with in the end of the war was a massive reorganization of Nazi networks for use in impending Cold War operations. And that is the area that I will continue next week, if I don't have time this week, with Merrill Lynch, E.F. Hutton, because that involves the vice president's family, his brother-in-law, and also the chief of staff of the White House. But it involves the cocaine persons linked to the Contras and the cocaine cartel in Colombia, with direct connections to Bolivia and Brazil, to Klaus Barbie, Joseph Mengele, who I still believe is alive, just as I believe Hitler was alive. But Kissinger, Kramer, and Sonnenfeld were active, setting up reorganization of Nazi networks in the Cold War operations. Their job was overseen by Allen Dulles, among others, and they drew up contacts that Allen Dulles established with most major fascist intelligence officers in Italy and Germany under a secret surrender negotiations with SS General Karl Wolff. Those negotiations are barely touched in Operation Sunrise. There's 2 books on it, but Wolff was a liaison to Himmler, and the network of the Cold War and the Nazification of the world was set up in those very offices in Bern, Switzerland, while our fellows were dying for 2 more years in the war, some of the most brutal fights. They were reorganizing and setting for what has been described as World War III and World War IV. Under this program, such figures as SS General Waldo Schellenberg, the heads of all foreign intelligence, SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny, and General Reinhard Gehlen were recruited as Anglo-American assets. Now, at the end of the war at Dachau prison was Otto Skorzeny and Hitler's General Fritz Kramer, and it was Senator Joe McCarthy that released them, Fritz Kramer, prisoner number 33. And if you have any doubts that that General Fritz Kramer isn't the one that runs our Pentagon, we have to pursue this a lot more. Don't have any doubts after years of research. To conclude this, it tells about General Gehlen, who was brought to this country as an Anglo-American asset. And it was out of this counterintelligence operation that Allen Dulles set up for his wartime post in Switzerland with U.S. Army intelligence sources, other organizations that he developed, and he developed a network from the OSS to the CIA. He had a code named Dora for a network, and then he started hiring people who would appear to be the left that were the right and set up that left-right network. Allen Dulles showed up in West Germany in 1946 with a Sandor Rado's wife, who was an instrumental figure in rebuilding the SPD left wing associated with Willy Brandt, Barr, and others. Now, all of this is important because this past week, Ronald Reagan has announced and stands behind the appointment of John O. Kohler as White House Communications Chief, Koehler. Now, I'm going to give you a research assignment I want you to write. You can write to Congressman Panetta. You can write to the White House. You don't have to bother Panetta. Call the White House. Call the Mr. Fitzwater, the organization in the White House that carries the press, whoever you want to write to, or any organizations that you think would be interested in this. This is an emergency because a member of Hitler's youth has been appointed to replace Mr. Buchanan in the White House to write the speeches for the president. John O. Kohler, the communications director, said he will not resign even though his post is effective March the 1st. So 1 week from today, he will become the communications director for the White House. He said he was 10 years old when he joined the Jungvolk, Jungvolk, which he said was the Boy Scouts run by the Nazi Party, and he said it was irrelevant in judging him because he has a Jewish wife. Nothing is further from the truth that because he has a Jewish wife, he can be a danger today. This makes a full cycle from Henry Kissinger, Fritz Kramer, Bitburg, Rudolf Hess, Alexander Haig, and the Nazification of America. Now, the important point is this. Mr. Kohler comes from the Associated Press. He's worked with the Associated Press. Okay, now remember that. Write it down. Associated Press. This is his past background. Did he know? Of course he worked with Vice President of Associated Press, Hal Buell. B-U-E-L-L. Hal Buell. Did Hal Buell go to Zurich in Switzerland in 1983, or the fall of 82 rather, with money from Klaus Barbie? Did he go with money from Klaus Barbie, which I had on the air, and the dates that he went there, I believe November 13th to 15th. The fourth thing is, did he deposit money in the bank account of Joseph Mengele? Did he carry money to Joseph Mengele's account? And another point is, did he travel with Fritz Kramer? A year later, the time he went with Kramer was in 1985. The years go so fast. So in 1985. Has he ever traveled with Fritz Kramer, the man whose background I gave you, to Zurich, Switzerland on the same plane, same day? Those are the characters that I said, and the State Department passed on a message about that bitch in California being on to what we're doing. It had to do with Fritz Kramer and Hal Buell going to Switzerland together And the contact man that I understood they met was the banker, the head of the accounts for Joseph Mengele in Switzerland. At the time of the question of whether Mengele was alive or not, through the Wiesenthal Institute, no thanks to them, but to Ralph Blumenthal of the New York Times, he was able to smoke out. Newsweek, May 20th, 1985, Joseph Mengele still has a lawyer in Frankfurt named Fritz Steinecker. Long listeners to World Watchers know that. Steinacker. Recently, the attorney said, yes, I've represented Mengele. He told Newsweek, I still do represent him. How do you represent a man who's been dead for 8 or 10 years? He said, I represent him. And the question is, why did they find Steinecker? Because I said that Hal Buell of the Associated Press traveled with the drug money that Klaus Barbie got to put in Bolivia, to put in the account of Joseph Mengele in Switzerland. That's what smoked out this story, and it's very important to go into it. Now, Hal Buell has an uncle in the State Department, and May 27th, 1985, I did broadcast. He works with World Medical Relief. That's Mr. Aderholt, the same person, Heine Aderholt, who's a defendant in the suit of the Christic Institute, who's been charged with murder, drug traffic, and gun running. The World Medical Relief is an organization that uses Pop Buell. They used Pop Buell, U.S. official, through whom Aderholt funneled World Medical Relief supplies. I bought a book called Mr. Pop. It's written by Don Sanchez, C-H-A-N-C-H-E. He knew Buell in Laos. The book doesn't talk much about Hal Buell's background, but Laos is the area out of the cocaine traffic area where Pop Buell worked, the uncle of the executive of Associated Press now, who obviously works with our new communications director. And out of Laos came General Secord and General Singh Laub and Thomas Cline of the CIA and Albert Hakim of the CIA. They were all involved. These defendants in the Christic suit were all involved in drug traffic in Laos. And what I had on the air in 1985 was a U.S. World Relief World Medical supplied through Mr. Buell. Pa Buell's name is Edgar Monroe Buell, Undersecretary of State in the State Department for over 20 years. Edgar Monroe Buell, as I said on the air, is the uncle of Hal Buell. The alleged link to Fritz Kramer, to the Institute of Historical Review, that's Liberty Lobby, to Joseph Mengele's attorney Fritz Steinecker, and the alleged links to Klaus Barbie and John DeLorean's missing money that went into Joseph Mengele's bank account in Zurich. Now, something happened on the way to the truth, and Ralph Blumenthal, who had called me, the writer for the New York Times, who said I was on the right track, and then went back to Germany when they were looking for Joseph Mengele, just very quickly shut up and said Mengele is dead. Now, that is exactly what is happening to Frank Carlucci when he says don't go into the Deputy Director of the Defense Department, Mr. Armitage, cut off Mr. Perot, and Perot is pretty important, cut it off, even if the President and the First Lady don't want drug dealers in our Defense Department, even though they have an investigation of someone as corrupt as Judge Kaufman, the very judge who barbecued the Rosenbergs, looking into narcotics for the President, cut the investigation off. Armitage is too important to the Defense Department. Well, if he's important to the Defense Department, then writers like Ralph Blumenthal can cut off the story because the reporters on the outside aren't as important as the inside of the Defense Department. Now, the area that Pop Buell worked for was the World Medical Relief. It's out of Detroit. The notables there, the head of it is General Aderholt. Their connections are with Kresge Corporation, General American Life Insurance, Manufacturers Bank, Detroit, Edison, and so forth. They sent aid to El Salvador and the death squads and the Contras, and during the 1960s and 70s, they sent $100 million in medical supplies to the U.S. counterinsurgency projects in Laos, of which General Aderholt participated, and of course that brought in Air America and the Southern Air and the airlines that it was Air America notably that became part of Southern Air that were the narcotics dealers, and they work along with U.S. Council for World Freedom, John Singelob's organization, and the Soldiers of Fortune, the Knights of Malta, the Friends of America, Mr. Tom Posey's groups. These interconnecting charitable organizations are directly linked to the Defense Department and to Fred Eakley, who shares offices with Fritz Kramer in the Defense Department or privately somewhere in Washington, D.C., where Kramer is identified with two particular groups, Daniel Graham of High Frontier and Star Wars, and Fred Eakley, who has the counter-revolutionaries, which equals fascism and guns and terrorism. And if you have any doubts about the importance of Klaus Barbie to these people and to cocaine traffic, next week I'll go into the relationship of the South America Nazi drugs to terrorism in Europe, to the network that was set up from the time the Mafia worked with the Nazis, worked with the Defense Department and the CIA. In this world, anything that is anti-Russian is okay. Cutting throats, decapitating, massacring individuals, torture, mass murders has continued through this very network. So now they want Reagan to go and walk out of the jail with Hess as a symbolic figure. They want a member of Hitler's Youth from the Associated Press to become the head of communications in the White House. And it's simultaneously, while all this is going on, we learn that Hitler probably didn't die in the bunker, which many people have known for a long time, and that Eva Braun is alive. And, of course, I know Joseph Mengele is alive, and so are Martin Bormann. And a few years later, you'll hear where they were buried, just as we heard where Hitler was buried. Well, you have a lot of homework. I want you to write to the White House, the communications director, or call if you have time. Some of you don't get this tape until next week, but we can continue asking and seeing what kinds of speeches he's writing. Remember, Buchanan was so instrumental in defending all Nazis from being deported, and now he and Mr. Wick of USIA have put in our new communications director. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week to continue the South American connections and the Nazi connections from Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Joseph Mengele and Barbie to Merrill Lynch and E.F. Hutton, and pick it up 1 week later and show you the importance of those connections.